Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today, if you couldn't tell from the title and the thumbnail, we are doing the case of Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden has been infamous throughout history, and I'm actually really excited and happy to be doing this case because even though two people died, and it's obviously very sad, it happened so long ago where it's not fresh and it's a little easier to talk about without becoming too upset. But I'm also happy to do it because this case hits my sweet spot. If you've been with me for a while, you know that I'm a huge history buff. And the Lizzie Borden case combines true crime and history in such a manner that I really enjoyed researching it. It was one of the first stories I remember hearing about when I was younger that I got really interested in, trying to figure out the mystery. Did she do it or did she not? So being able to tell you this story makes me feel like I'm in my element, and I'm really excited to just dive right in. And since I've been an avid fan of Lizzie Borden and her story, I can tell you it's almost like a made-for-TV movie. There's so much drama, so many dynamics between the cast of characters, so many different motivations for why everybody does what they do. It's obviously never as cut and dry as this person killed this person, the end. But I loved being able to research this video and get to the core of who Lizzie Borden was, who the members of her family were, and what motivated them to behave in the way they did throughout their lives up till the very end. So I'll do a quick recap for you if you do not know who Lizzie Borden is, or this is your first experience with this case. Back in the late 1800s, Lizzie Borden's father and stepmother were basically hacked to death, which what we believe to be an axe or a hatchet of some kind. Lizzie was put on trial for their murders, but she was acquitted. There have been several songs throughout history which still refer to Lizzie as a murderess. Even though she was acquitted in a court of law, everybody still goes on believing that she did it. And there's a pretty good reason for that. The most popular song that refers to Lizzie Borden is the Child's Jump Rope song. And children's songs back then were notorious for being related or talking about some pretty dark things. Like Ring Around the Rosie is supposed to be about the bubonic plague. And I swear every time it comes on one of Bella's kids TV programs on YouTube and she grabs my hands and she wants me to do it with her, I'm still creeped out by it. But this jump rope song that talked about Lizzie Borden goes, Lizzie Borden took an axe. She gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Now there's a lot of inaccuracies in this song. Obviously, it's a children's song, so we can't expect it to be factually correct. But Lizzie Borden didn't actually kill her mother, it was her stepmother, and neither the father nor the stepmother had 40 or 41 whacks. It was less than that, but still pretty excessive. It's still a mystery today who killed Abby and Andrew Borden, but many people believe that Lizzie Borden got away with murder. So who are the Bordens? Let's dive in. Andrew Jackson Borden was born on September 13th, 1822 in Fall River, Massachusetts. His family had been one of the founding families in Fall River, and they had made their fortunes in cotton mills. Many New England towns at this time were growing into industrious and prosperous cities because of their many rivers which powered the mills. Unfortunately, Andrew Borden was from the less wealthy branch of the family, and throughout his youth, he often struggled with money. He lived in the same town as the rest of his cousins and family, but it was as if they were living in two separate worlds. Andrew lived in the poorer part of town, and the rest of his family lived on the hill, which was the affluent neighborhood in Fall River. So he's basically, struggling to make it by, and his cousins are over here living in mansions and going to parties. But Andrew Borden would not be a victim of his circumstances. He worked hard, and in doing so, he gained his own wealth. He began manufacturing and selling furniture and caskets. He also accumulated a great deal of property that he would rent out. He became a successful real estate developer. He directed several textile mills. So Andrew was a self-made man. Everything he had, he worked for and got himself. He wasn't handed anything from his family because his branch of the family didn't have it to give. By the time of his death, Andrew Borden was an extremely wealthy man. He was worth over $10 million in today's money. But he didn't achieve that from being a nice guy. He didn't achieve it from partaking in recreation or frivolity. And he definitely didn't get that from not knowing how to properly manage his money. Andrew was described as a no-nonsense guy, extremely shrewd with money, almost to the point of penny pinching. He's been described as basically a Scrooge, that he hoarded all his money and he didn't want to spend any of it. People have also said he didn't really have any sense of humor in him at all. But before life hardened him, he met a young woman named Sarah Anthony Morse. She was pretty and sweet, and they got married when he was 23 and she was 22 on Christmas Day in 1845. The two would be married 5 years before they had their first child, a daughter named Emma Lenora Borden, born on the 1st of March, 1851. It almost makes me wonder if they had trouble conceiving, because back in those days, and you're going to hear me say back in those days a lot, because it's insane how different it was in the 1800s than it is today. But back in those days, your main purpose as a woman was to get married and to keep a house and to have children. So for them to be married and not have a child for 5 years, it didn't really make a lot of sense. It's not as if women in those days were trying to get a career or traveling, trying to see the world before they settled down with a family. That just wasn't the point of their existence. The point of their existence was to be a wife and a mother. Sarah and her daughter Emma were very close. Sarah taught Emma how to cook, how to keep a house, how to be caring and nurturing. So Emma was very excited when she was given a new baby sister, another 5 years later. Alice Esther Borden was born on May 3rd, 1956. Both her sister and her mother doted on her. She was a new baby. Emma at that time would have been about 5, probably super excited to have another kid in the house, just being her and her mother and her father. Sarah really was a good mother and loved being a mother and loved having daughters around her to raise. Sarah showed Emma how to properly care for the baby, how to feed her and clothe her and diaper her, how to rock her to sleep at night and soothe her if she woke up in the middle of the night. The entire family was obviously devastated when Alice died just 2 months before her second birthday. They called it dropsy back then, but the medical term for it is hydrocephalus, which just means excess spinal fluid will build up in the brain and cause pressure in the skull. Today, this is very treatable, and many people live with this condition. In fact, I think it's one of the most common developmental issues that children are born with. However, back then, many children died from this, and little Alice was one of them. It would be another 4 years before Andrew and Sarah had another child. Lizzie Andrew Borden, born on July 19, 1860, was a very cared for child. Both Sarah and Emma were grateful to have another chance with a little girl. Unfortunately, this wasn't the end of the Borden's hardships, and Lizzie would only get to have her mother with her for a very short time. On March 26, 1863, when Lizzie was just 2.5 and Emma was 12, Sarah Borden died from uterine congestion and a spinal disease. On her deathbed, she made her oldest daughter, Emma, promise to always look after Lizzie. And Emma had been groomed for this by her mother, to be a loving and maternal figure. Rosie, you're drinking incredibly loudly. Emma didn't take the promise to her mother with a grain of salt. It was a responsibility she took incredibly seriously. Emma made a promise at 12 years old that would have caused her to grow up very quickly. And for the next 2 years, she was the lady of the house. She took care of little Lizzie, fed her, bathed her, clothed her, sang her to sleep at night, brushed her hair in the morning. Andrew Borden was still recovering from the loss of the love of his life. He was also busy wearing his many hats, and he had his hands into many different projects. So I don't believe he was a very attentive or present paternal figure, but he had been offered help from other women in the town, even from his own family, his own sister, and he'd turned them down. Emma was the sole care provider for Lizzie at 12. Can you imagine? But she wouldn't be for long. On June 6, 1865, Andrew married Abby Durfee Gray. Abby was childless and unmarried, giving her the label of a spinster at the ripe old age of 37. Once again, in those days, this was very common. If you were 37, you hadn't gotten married, and you didn't have kids, society pretty much considered you worthless, because a woman's worth was in her ability to be a wife and a mother. Her family, just as old and at one time respected as the Bordens, had fallen from grace. She had no prospects, and Andrew needed someone to care for his 2 daughters. I don't think this was a romantic love in any way. Andrew Borden would have been 43 at this time, and he'd already had his young love, head over heels, love at first sight kind of experience with Sarah. I think this was an arrangement that suited them both. More so, I think, it suited Abby, because she, like I said, didn't have any prospects. And here was Andrew Borden, a good man. He wasn't abusive as far as anybody knew, and he had money. So back in those days, that was considered a catch, especially if you were a dried up old spinster. I believe they surely liked and respected each other, but I think that's pretty much as far as it went. And Abby and Andrew would never go on to have any children of their own, even though they were married for a long time. And as far as Abby Borden goes, I think she gets a bad rep in history, especially in media portrayals of her. And there's a lot of movies and TV shows about Lizzie Borden and her family. And Abby is sometimes portrayed as the evil stepmother. In reality, though, it was the other way around. When she arrived at the Borden home, she wanted very badly to connect with her new husband's 2 daughters. She had no children of her own, and at that point, it was very unlikely she would. Emma and Lizzie were her only chance of being a mother, especially Lizzie, because at that point, she was only 5, and because she had been so young when her mother passed, she didn't really remember her. However, Abby's arrival was given a very cold reception by the 2 girls. Emma had been caring for Lizzie since she was born, and now this new woman wanted to come in and take over. I almost have to wonder if Emma planted in Lizzie's young and impressionable brain, she's not your mother. Our mother died. I've been the one who's been taking care of you. I'm the one that loves you. Being so young at the time and not having the personal allegiance to Sarah that Emma had, I'm not sure that Lizzie would have developed the dislike for her father's new wife that Emma had. Maybe she would have even welcomed her. Maybe they would have even had a really good relationship. In 1866, Emma went to study at the Wheaton Female Seminary in Norton, Massachusetts. She was only able to come back home and see her sister on holidays. Now, this isn't written anywhere, but we know that Andrew Borden paid for this education. And I'm almost inclined to believe that he sent her to Wheaton against her will. Maybe she would have wanted to go somewhere closer so she could have been near the family and she could have seen her little sister a lot more. There were many schools for young women that were a lot closer, and she could have come home and visited more often. Yet he chose to send her to a school that was 25 miles away. I wonder if he noticed that his older daughter was turning his younger daughter against his new wife, and he wanted to kind of remove her from the equation. Now, this could have also been about price and money, because the Wheaton school was cheaper than the schools that were closer to Fall River. Unfortunately, because Andrew Borden is not around today, we can't ask him what his motives were, and I almost have a feeling he wouldn't tell us anyway. During Emma's absence, Lizzie and Abby actually did get closer. It was at this time that Abby gave Lizzie a beautiful silver engraved cup, and Lizzie would sometimes write to Emma and say things like, "Mother and I did this, Mother and I did that." Emma would possibly have noticed that Lizzie was warming up to Abby and not liked that one bit. In any event, Emma did not remain at Wheaton long. She was there for about a year and a half before she discontinued her studies, came home to Fall River to pick up her role again as Lizzie's mother. In 1873, Andrew moved his family to a nicer home located at 92 2nd Street. Andrew had chosen this location because it was in town, it was close to his business interests, and he could operate everything he needed to do right from where he lived. He was in walking distance of all the things he had money into. The home had previously been functioning as a double family home or a duplex. And when the family moved in, they didn't do much to connect the two sides of the house. Essentially, they shared the living area downstairs, but the upstairs was very separated. Andrew and Abby had their rooms on one side, and Lizzie and Emma had their rooms on the other side. And you couldn't really get in to the rooms from the other side of the house without going downstairs and then back up a separate set of stairs. So I believe, if I'm correct, Andrew and Abby's bedrooms would have been accessed from the stairs in the kitchen, and Lizzie and Emma's bedrooms would have been accessed from the stairs in like the main entryway or the sitting room. Now, all the rooms on the top floor were connected by doors. It's a very strange layout. They were all connected by doors. But many of these doors were always kept locked, some boarded up, some had furniture pushed up against them, so you didn't really have access to each room from the other rooms because the doors were locked. Lizzie's bedroom was right next to her father and Abby's bedroom, but she kept the door locked up tight and a writing desk, a big wooden writing desk, pushed up against the door. And Lizzie was very unhappy with life on 2nd Street. She wanted to live where her richer Borden cousins lived, on the hill. That was where it was at. That was where everything was happening. That was where a young woman who might be looking for a husband wanted to be, being introduced to society, having her coming out, meeting new people, being introduced to eligible bachelors who would give her this wealthy life that she thought she deserved and was entitled to. And she knew her father had a lot of money. That's what pissed her off more than anything, because she knew they could have lived there. They could have had that life. But Andrew Borden wasn't about that. He didn't believe in frivolity. He didn't believe in spending your money on stupid things like parties and champagne. And they certainly lived in a way they didn't have to, I guess, considering how wealthy they were. However, I think it's often blown out of proportion how the house was, how the girls were kept. And I'm going to explain that to you. In a lot of retellings of the Lizzie Borden story, they would have you think that Lizzie and Emma and Andrew and Abby, they were living in basically a state of poverty, while their other family, the rich Bordens, they were living it up on the hill, drinking champagne out of golden goblets. Now, it's true that the home did use kerosene lamps when electricity had been around for 20 years, and many of the homes in Fall River were wired for electricity, but the Borden home still used kerosene lamps. But you'll hear it said that they didn't even have running water. And for a while, they didn't. But as soon as city water was made available to that area of 2nd Street, Andrew Borden had it connected to their home. And they actually had running water before a lot of homes on the hill did. You can see in the pictures of the home at this time, there were radiators, so the house was centrally heated. The house was furnished nicely. They had plenty of food. The girls were given monthly allowances. So yeah, there may not have been crystal chandeliers and champagne fountains in every room, but they were in no way struggling or living in poverty. You can also see in the pictures of the family at this time, they all seem very well dressed, especially Emma and Lizzie. Emma, Lizzie, and Abby were all regulars at the dressmaker's shop in town because they would often go in to get fitted for dresses. Andrew hired outside help, maids, to come in to help with the cooking and the cleaning. He even sent Lizzie on a 1-year tour of Europe, which I know would be quite expensive today, and I'm sure in the 1800s it was expensive as well. This doesn't show me a picture of a family dressed in rags, huddling by the fireplace for warmth, walking around with a candle, peeing in a bucket and having to dump it outside, and I feel like that's always the picture that's been portrayed. I honestly believe Andrew Borden was a man who worked hard for his money. Like I said, he was self-made. Nobody handed it to him. It wasn't family money passed down. He didn't have to work for, so he didn't care where it went. He was smart with his money. He saved it. He invested it, and he didn't think it was necessary to spend money on things that were not necessary. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, history has sometimes villainized Andrew Borden, villainized Abby Borden, almost as if they're giving Lizzie a reason. Like, well, yeah, she probably did kill them, but Abby was kind of a bitch, and Andrew, he was tight with his money, so they had it coming. And I know that's the more interesting story. I know that also lends to the motive of why Lizzie might have done this. However, once again, I do think it's been exaggerated in the media especially, and therefore when things are exaggerated in the media and people see them on TV, like there's that Lizzie Borden television show where Christina Ricci plays Lizzie Borden. And it's an amazing show. It's a very entertaining show. She's amazing as Lizzie Borden. I loved it. But it's so inaccurate in almost every single way. But somebody might come from that show and think that's the truth. So always do your research, especially if you're interested in history. There's plenty to be found out there. But Lizzie had a big problem with how smart Andrew was with his money. She would go and visit her cousins in their spacious, gleaming mansions on the hill. And she was a part of them, but she was still an outsider because they would be going to these society balls, they would be having parties, and she was not included in that. She would go there to have tea, to play cards, but when nighttime came and the actual important things happened, the things that you wanted to be a part of, to be considered high in society, when those things happened, she wasn't invited. In school, Lizzie was so-so. The principal at Morgan Street School said Lizzie was pretty average as far as academics went. He said she wasn't exceptionally smart or noticeably dull, and she was often moody. It became pretty well known throughout town that Lizzie was not afraid to speak negatively about her stepmother. Mr. Benson, Lizzie's principal, would eventually move into the Borden's neighborhood, and he became acquainted with Abby Borden, and he had nothing but nice things to say about her. He said Abby was a lovely person, kind and loving, who tried ineffectually to win the affections of her stepdaughters. After the murders, Mr. Benson and others in the town were interviewed about Lizzie, and they had pretty much the same things to say about her. They described Lizzie as a sensitive child, and she had problems meeting and interacting with new people. In school, she only had one really close girlfriend, and she kind of kept to herself otherwise. And a lot of people didn't gravitate towards her because she was known to have a sarcastic and sharp tongue, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Although Lizzie was just average, she wasn't remarkably bright, she still managed to get decent marks in school. Her junior year of high school, she gave up, she left school, and she never went back. She was very active in the church though. She developed a lot of relationships in the church. She taught Sunday school to the kids every Sunday. She was very pious, very respected in the church, and she would often be at the church. That was kind of her place where she felt accepted, she felt happy, she felt like she had a purpose. Now, 1887 is the time when Lizzie stops calling Abby mother and starts referring to her as Mrs. Borden or even just simply Mrs. B. This would also correspond with the time when Emma would be coming back from the female seminary school for good. Emma never called Abby mother. She didn't even have the respect for her to call her Mrs. Borden. She was always just Abby, which is very, very disrespectful. Not only because Abby was Emma's stepmother, but because she was her elder. You shouldn't call somebody who's in that position to you by their first name, especially back in those days. Now today, yeah, we call our step-parents by their first names all the time. That's pretty much all we do call them. But back in the day, if you had a stepmother, you would call her mother or refer to her by her married name out of respect. In 1889, after the family moves into the 2nd Street home, Bridget Sullivan is hired on to become a maid there. Bridget was an Irish immigrant who did the cooking and some cleaning around the house, and for some reason, Emma and Lizzie called her Maggie. That's not her name, but they called her Maggie. A lot of accounts say it was a term of endearment, although I do not see how calling somebody by a name that's not theirs is endearing. But many accounts also say that this had been a previous maid of the Bordens, and Lizzie and Emma just couldn't be bothered to learn the new maid's name. and I tend to believe that story a little bit more. According to Bridget, the family never raised their voice at each other, but the tension was palpable. In fact, at some points it became too much for her, and she tried to give her notice and leave the house 2 to 3 times. It's rumored that Abby Borden begged her to stay, even giving her a raise out of her own pocket so she wouldn't leave, probably because Bridget was the only woman in that household who liked or would talk to Abby. On June 24th, 1891, the Borden home was broken into. Andrew Borden went to the police station and filed a report, and they began to look into it. Apparently, the house had been entered in broad daylight when his daughters and his maid were all home. Not much had been taken, and everything that was taken from Andrew and Abby's bedroom. The door to Abby and Andrew's bedroom was always kept locked. However, the police found a 6 to 8 inch penny nail still stuck in the keyhole of the door. So somebody had, it looks like, jimmied it open or picked the lock. The items missing were $80 in cash, $30 in gold, and Abby's gold watch and chain that had been gifts to her from her family. Nothing else was missing or out of place, and the 3 women who were present when the robbery went down, they said they didn't see anything or hear anything. 2 weeks after the break-in, Andrew went back to the police station and put a stop to the investigation into the break-in. Why did he do this? So if you're wondering why I'm wearing a different shirt and my hair is different, I would tell you that it is a long story, and I promise to share it with you someday, but not today, because let's get on with the video. After the break-in at the Borden home, Andrew Borden would still lock his room every day at night, but he would leave the key on the mantle in the sitting room, and some speculate this is why he told the cops to stop looking into the robbery. He would leave the key there because he knew it was somebody in the house who had broken into his room and taken the money and the jewelry. And he left the key there as a warning to them, as if to say, try it again, I dare you. Many people did suspect Lizzie of this theft. She was a known shoplifter. She was such a well-known shoplifter in town that every store and shop in the town knew that if she came in and stole something, which she often did, that they should just mark it down and charge Andrew Borden, and he would pay for it, as he always did. And this reminded me so much of the Jim Jones video I did, because that's exactly what Jim Jones' mother did for him. Jim Jones would go and shoplift and take candy and things from the stores, and instead of saying anything to him, the shopkeepers would just keep a tally, and when his mother came around at the end of the week, she would pay for everything he'd taken. Now, to me, this does sound like irresponsible parenting, because there's no actual repercussions for the behavior. Yet it still doesn't sound to me like a father who's keeping his daughter from the things she wants. It doesn't sound to me like a father who's so stingy with his money that he won't let her have anything. She went and basically took whatever she wanted, and then he would just pay for it. And I don't believe he ever said anything to her about it. In fact, Lizzie and Andrew were exceptionally close. It was said she was almost like the son he never had. They would go fishing together. She would help him with some of his business dealings later in life. They spent a lot of time together, and she actually gave him a gold ring that he wore every single day until the day he died. I have to wonder as well, when somebody broke into the Borden home and went into Andrew and Abby's room, why was Andrew and Abby's room the only one they focused on? Why was most of the stuff taken from that room Abby's, and especially sentimental things that had been given to her by her family? It almost seemed as if Abby was the victim or the target of the attack. Tensions between the Borden daughters and their stepmother escalated within the months before the murders. Abby Borden's own stepmother, Jane Gray, she had been given a house by her husband, Oliver Gray, who was Abby's actual father. And when he died, he passed it down to her, but she decided to sell it. This would leave Abby's half-sister, Sarah, her husband, and her children pretty much homeless, because that's where they'd lived their whole lives. And Abby and Sarah were very, very close. So Abby went to her husband and begged him to purchase the house so that her half-sister and her family could retain their home. Andrew did that, and he put the house into Abby's name so that Sarah and her family could remain there. Now, this threw Lizzie and Emma into a fury. They were not happy about it at all. They told him verbatim, "What you've done for Abby's people, you should do for us." This is such entitlement though, right? And you'll see this. There's this thread of entitlement that flows throughout Lizzie Borden's life. She feels she's entitled to a better life. She feels she's entitled to a house on the hill. She feels she's entitled to the lives of her cousins. She feels like she's entitled to whatever she steals from these stores. And now, because her father gave her stepmother something by doing a favor for her family, she's entitled to him to do the same for her. Lizzie began to show an even more unveiled resentment towards her stepmother, especially in public. One day while Lizzie was at the dressmaker was talking to her about a dress that she was making for Abby, and she called Abby Lizzie's mother. Lizzie spat out at her, "Don't say that to me. She's a mean, good-for-nothing thing." The dressmaker was like, you don't mean that, Lizzie. Pretty much probably really awkward. Lizzie responded, "Yes, I don't have much to do with her. I stay in my room most of the time." She then goes on to tell the dressmaker that she and Emma don't even take meals with their father and stepmother any longer, unless they absolutely have to. And once again, in these times, that was pretty much unheard of. A family would eat together, which I wish was more of a trend in today's day and age, but a family would eat together. And if they weren't eating together, it definitely signified that there was something wrong with the dynamics inside the house. In order to keep the peace, Andrew gifted to his daughter the house that his father had left him when he died. And this was 12 Ferry Street, the house where they had been born and grown up, the house where their mother died. They didn't actually live there though. In the 1800s, if a woman was unmarried, it was highly frowned upon for her to move out of her father's home and live alone. And since Lizzie and Emma were still kind of respected in society because of their father, they couldn't do such a thing. But they did rent it out and they collected rents, which the money from the rents went into their own pockets. Andrew told them, "I'll give you this house, but it would be much appreciated if you could be a little bit nicer to your stepmother." And Abby and Emma smiled sweetly, said they would, and then proceeded to shun Abby's family in public. At that time, being acknowledged on the street by a peer or somebody who lived in your town, that was a sign of respect. So when Abby's family would pass Lizzie and Emma in the streets, they would say hello. And Lizzie and Emma would ignore them as if they hadn't spoken. This spoke much louder about their opinion of Abby and her family than any words possibly could have. So essentially, Lizzie Borden was kind of a jerk. A few weeks before the murders, Lizzie and Emma sold the Ferry Street house back to their father for a sum of $5,000 to be split equally between the two. And this was a pretty good amount of money in 1892. But the summer of 1892 was a hard one for the family. Apparently, there was a big flock of pigeons living in the Borden's barn, and Lizzie took it upon herself to make these pigeons her pets, essentially. She would feed them and go in and talk to them and make sure they were taken care of. Whatever you want to say about Lizzie Borden, she loved animals. She was crazy about dogs. She would often go riding, and her neighbors would say that there was always a stray cat or two around the house because she was feeding them. There's a story about Lizzie killing her stepmother's cat, and it's absolutely false. Lizzie would never hurt an animal. Lizzie was the kind of person who liked animals more than she liked most humans, which I can relate to some days. Which is why in June of 1892, when Andrew Borden went in and killed all these pigeons, it was a serious issue. It wasn't determined whether he twisted their heads off or cut their heads off with a hatchet, but he beheaded every one of them and he brought them into the house while Lizzie was home so that Bridget could pluck their feathers and put them in a stew. A lot of accounts say that he did this in order to punish Lizzie or to send her a message, but that's once again pretty much false. There's no proof of that. What's more likely is that the neighborhood boys would often break into the barn to mess with the pigeons and throw stones at them and things. And one of these times, a couple stones that were thrown broke a barn window, and Andrew Borden got rid of the pigeons to get rid of the boys in the barn who were breaking in and messing with his windows. In the days leading up to the deaths, the entire family comes down with some sort of stomach illness that leaves them all completely weak and nauseous, throwing up all the time. Once again, there's rumors that they got food poisoning because Andrew Borden, being the penny pincher he was, made them eat spoiled mutton because he didn't want it to go to waste. In reality, Bridget, the maid, came forward and said it wasn't the mutton. The mutton had only been consumed the morning of the murders. She thinks that a couple days prior to that, she had prepared some swordfish, and that's what caused the sickness. On August 2nd, the day that everyone woke up feeling very ill, Lizzie attempted to buy prussic acid, which is basically cyanide. Eli Bentz at Smith's Pharmacy testified that she came in, asked for the prussic acid, and said she wanted to clean a sealskin cape. Once again, a girl who's wearing sealskin capes doesn't appear to be one who's going hungry or wanting for anything, but Eli told her she couldn't just purchase the prussic acid because it was a dangerous substance, that she needed a prescription for it. And Lizzie kind of argued with him and the other pharmacist, saying, I bought it here before, just give it to me. And they were like, we can't. They stuck to their guns. Abby Borden was feeling so sick that on that day, August 2nd, she visited the family doctor, Dr. Seabury Bowen. I just want to say that everybody had such cool names back then, nothing compared to the kind of names that we have today. They all seem so important, like names of lords. Seabury Bowen, it's just, they have all cool names. But regardless, Dr. Bowen had been the family physician for 12 years, and he lived right across the street from the Bordens, so he was familiar with them on a professional and personal level. While Abby was there at Dr. Bowen's, she told him she was feeling so sick, she was concerned that somebody was trying to poison them. He discouraged her from this kind of thinking and told her, you're just feeling sick, you probably have a stomach flu, don't worry, go home and rest. The early afternoon of August 3rd, the family had an unexpected visitor, John Vinicum Morse. Vinicum. Cool names. John Morse was Sarah Borden's brother, so he was Emma and Lizzie's maternal uncle. He and Andrew Borden had remained friends, and John would often visit the family and stay for a couple of days if he had business in town or he was visiting family in town. He arrived at the home about 1:30 that afternoon, and he says he saw Abby, he saw Andrew, and he saw Bridget, but he did not see Lizzie or Emma. Now, Emma was actually out of town at this time. She'd been in Fairhaven, Massachusetts for about 2 weeks at this point, visiting some friends, so she wasn't anywhere near the home in the days leading up to the murders. He says he had some dinner, and Abby and Andrew sat with him even though they'd already eaten, and then he left the house to run some errands. When he got back, it was about 8:30 at night, and Andrew and Abby were still up in the sitting room. John sat with them in the sitting room for a little bit. Abby went to bed, and shortly after, Andrew went to bed, and then John went up to his room. John says at this point, while they were in the sitting room that evening, he had heard somebody come in through the door, walk up the stairs, and open and close the door to Lizzie's room, but he still had not seen his niece. Later, when John went up to bed, he had to pass by Lizzie's room because it was right next door to the guest room where he was staying, and he said the door was closed, he didn't hear anything, and he did not see her that night either. Now, it is highly debated why John was there that day. He was Lizzie and Emma's uncle, so it wouldn't be strange for him to visit. And like I said, he and Andrew were friends and did have some business dealings together. Some people say that John was there to talk about Andrew's will, but that was never proven, and there was nobody who could say that's what they talked about. I don't believe even John said that that's what they talked about, because I read his entire testimony, and he never mentioned that, at least in his court testimony or his reports to the police. The night of August 3rd, Lizzie visited her close friend Alice Russell, and she told Alice that everyone in the house had been very ill, except for Maggie, who was actually Bridget. Alice asked Lizzie, do you think it was something you ate? And Lizzie responded, I'm not sure. We had some baker's bread and we all ate quite a bit of it except for Bridget, and she was the only one who wasn't sick, so it could have been that. And Alice was like, I don't think it was the baker's bread because everyone in town gets the bread from the bakers and I haven't heard of anyone else being sick. Lizzie then switches and says, well, maybe it's the milk that's left on our doorstep every morning at 4 a.m. Maybe somebody's poisoning the milk before it comes into our house. Lizzie at this point tells Alice something that I find strange. She says, they were all awfully sick. I wasn't sick. I mean, I wasn't throwing up, but I could hear them all throwing up. She said she stepped to the doorway of Abby and Andrew's room after she was hearing them vomiting, and she asked if there was anything that she could do, and they said no. So I'm a little confused because Lizzie told Alice at first that everybody was sick, including herself. Only Bridget was not sick. Then she says, I wasn't sick. Well, I mean, I wasn't throwing up. So if you're not throwing up and everybody else is, it's possible you didn't ingest the same thing that everybody else ingested. And it turned out that Bridget had been very sick as well. So either Lizzie didn't pay enough attention to her maid to notice that she too was sick, or she lied. Lizzie then tells her friend that she's afraid somebody wants to harm her father. She said her father had a lot of business acquaintances and they would sometimes have strong words with each other and she would overhear it. And I mean, it was kind of true that Andrew Borden was a shrewd businessman. He operated his business dealings with very little emotion. So if somebody came to him and said, I can't pay the rent this month, my wife's sick, or I broke my leg, Andrew Borden would basically be like, okay, so I'll wait for your rent on the first of the month, because if you don't pay your rent, you're not going to live there anymore. Lizzie then goes on to say that the barn has been broken into twice, the house has been broken into once, and all 3 of these times happened in broad daylight, which she found to be odd, and I find that to be odd as well. She said, "I feel as if I want to sleep with my eyes half open, or they will burn the house down over us." Who's they? And how is sleeping with your eyes half open going to prevent them from burning the house down over you? About her father, she said, "I fear that somebody will do something to him. I don't know what, but somebody will do something. He's so discourteous to people." At this time, I absolutely 100% believe that Lizzie was setting her friend up to suspect that something might happen to her father, because she planned on killing them. At this point, I think she was just laying the groundwork. She may not have been that book smart, but I do think she was very manipulative and calculating. The fact that her father had business dealings with people who may not have always liked him, or the fact that he might have been not really nice to these people all of the time, it doesn't necessarily suggest that your next step would be to think somebody was going to kill him or hurt him. If that happened to everybody who was discourteous to people, there would be thousands and thousands of random stabbings every day, because people would just, go purge on everyone. It doesn't make sense that Lizzie would have such a disquieting feeling the day before her father and stepmother are murdered, that something's going to happen, like she predicted it. I do believe she was setting the stage for when they did die, they were murdered, for the people around her to believe that it had been an outside force. The next day, August 4th, is the last day that Andrew and Abby Borden will wake up and see the light of morning. Here is the timeline from that day, from the testimony of Lizzie herself, Bridget, and John Morse, who were the only 3 people besides Andrew and Abby who were in the house that day when this all went down. John Morse woke up around 6 a.m. that day, and as he left his room, he passed Lizzie's room and he noticed the door was closed. He went downstairs, and shortly after he got downstairs, Andrew Borden woke up and followed. And after that, Abby Borden woke up and she came downstairs. At 7 a.m., they all sat down at the table together and had breakfast, which included some mutton, some coffee cake, and some bread. After about 90 minutes of eating and chatting, they all got up from the table. Andrew and John went into the sitting room to talk a little bit, and Abby began dusting. At about 8:45, John went to leave the house. He had some things to take care of in town, and Andrew Borden walked him to the door so that he could lock it behind him. This was a common practice. Anytime somebody would leave, the person who lived at the house or another person who was in the house would follow that person to the door, let them out, and then lock the door firmly behind them. John Morse then went to the post office and he visited a niece, and he was with her until about 11:20 a.m., where he proceeded to make his way back to the Borden home. Bridget says she woke up around 6:30 that morning. It was a very hot and humid day, over 90 degrees, and she was still feeling ill from the poisoning or the illness that the rest of the family had. She then got started on the breakfast dishes, and she said while she was standing there at the sink, she saw Mr. Borden take a slop bucket outside, dump it in the yard, and then walk over to the pear tree, where he proceeded to pick a basket of pears and bring them back inside the house. Lizzie has not yet made an appearance. Bridget says she saw Andrew Borden walk John to the door, let him out, re-lock the door. At this point, he came into the kitchen and began to brush his teeth in the kitchen sink. He then took a bowl of water and brought it up to his room, most likely to wash up, because he had to leave that day and take care of some business things. 5 minutes after Andrew Borden had gone upstairs with his bowl of water, Lizzie Borden entered the kitchen, and Bridget asked Lizzie if she wanted any breakfast. Lizzie said she didn't really think she did, but there were some molasses cookies that she might eat, and she was going to have coffee. Bridget saw Lizzie get a cup of coffee and go to sit down at the kitchen table with it. But at this point, Bridget began to feel violently ill, so she ran out the kitchen door towards the backyard where the barn was and the pear tree was. She ran out that door and she threw up, and she said she was out there for about 10 to 15 minutes. When she collected herself, she came back into the kitchen, re-latched the screen door, which also always remained locked, and she began to finish the breakfast dishes. At this time, Bridget sees Abby Borden, and Abby tells her that she wants Bridget to clean the windows of the house inside and out. They're filthy. Bridget's not too pleased about this because it's very hot out. She's got some sort of stomach bugs. She's throwing up all the time, and it's a pretty big job, all the windows in the house inside and out. But this was the last interaction that Bridget would have with Abby, the last time she would see her alive. This was about 9 a.m. At this time, it's about 9 a.m., and Bridget says that she hasn't seen Lizzie anywhere since she saw Lizzie take her coffee to the table. So Bridget goes down to the cellar, fills a bucket with water, gets the window cleaning supplies, and comes back up, and then she goes outside to get started. But then out of nowhere, Lizzie pops up, and she approaches Bridget outside, and she asks Bridget, "Hey, are you gonna clean the windows?" I think it's pretty obvious that she is. Bridget says yes, she's going to clean the windows. And she also tells Lizzie that she's going to be outside keeping an eye on things. So Lizzie doesn't have to lock the door to the kitchen, but if she feels more comfortable doing that, she can lock the door. And Bridget would get her water from the barn, and she could knock when she wanted to come in. It seemed like this family was really big on keeping the doors locked, which might suggest that there was some kind of outside threat that they knew about, but nobody else did. They were very big on locking the door at all times. Bridget then made her way around the house cleaning the outside windows. She talked to one of the neighbor maids for a little bit. She says at no point did she see anybody come into the house, leave the house, or walk around inside the house while she was cleaning the windows and looking inside of the house. She then went into the house to start on the interior windows, and she locked the screen door that led to the backyard behind her. It was at this point, as she started on the windows in the sitting room, that she heard Andrew Borden trying to get into the house. He was jiggling his key in the lock, and he was trying to open the door, but he couldn't. He started ringing the bell and knocking, so Bridget ran over to the door to let him in, and all the locks were latched. So obviously he wouldn't be able to get in using his key because the latches were all closed from the inside. And as she's trying to open all the latches, they're stuck and she can't get them open, and she makes a frustrated sound, and she hears laughter coming from the top of the stairs, and it was Lizzie's voice. Bridget thought that was odd because her father was trapped outside and couldn't get in the house. Bridget was frustrated because she couldn't get the locks undone, and Lizzie was giggling about it from upstairs. Andrew Borden typically wouldn't have been home this early. He'd left the house almost right after he washed up, but he'd been feeling sick again while he was on his journeys, and he thought it was just better to call it a day and go home and rest. After Andrew Borden was let in, Bridget went about her tasks, and she said she heard Lizzie talking to her father in the sitting room. Lizzie claims that her father came in, he was reading the paper for a little bit, and then he settled in to rest a little bit because he wasn't feeling good, and he would often take a nap in the afternoons if he was not feeling good. Even though this was not the afternoon yet, this was still pretty early morning. Bridget also heard Andrew Borden ask Lizzie where Mrs. Borden was, and Lizzie said she received a note this morning that she had to go out and help a sick friend. According to Bridget, Lizzie then came into the kitchen and took out an ironing board as if she was going to iron something, and the two started chatting. Bridget actually asked Lizzie, who's the sick friend that Mrs. Borden had to go see? And Lizzie was like, I don't know. Bridget proceeded to clean the two windows that she had left on the interior of the home. She went back in the kitchen so that she could clean and hang the rags she'd used to wash the windows. And while she's doing this, Lizzie approaches her and asks her, hey, you plan on going out today? And Bridget said, I may or I may not. I'm still not really feeling well. And Lizzie said, well, just so you know, there's a sale going on at Sargent's right now. It's only 8 cents for a yard of fabric, and you can go if you want. You should go. And Bridget was like, okay, but I'm really not feeling well. So Bridget decided to go upstairs and rest because she was really sick. And it seemed as if Lizzie was trying to get Bridget out of the house at this point. She asked the maid if she was leaving, and when Bridget said she may or may not, it almost seemed like Lizzie was giving her an incentive or a motivation to leave. Bridget made her way up to her attic room, and she laid down, and as soon as she laid down, she heard the town hall clock strike the hour of 11. She did not fall asleep. She was just resting, and she claims at this point she heard no sounds of doors opening or closing, anyone entering or leaving the house. And from her spot in her room, she could often hear the sounds of doors opening and closing and people walking around, leaving, coming, and going. She heard nothing. She heard nothing until she'd been laying there about 10 to 15 minutes, and Lizzie screamed up at her, "Maggie, come quick. Father is dead. Someone has come in and killed him." So Bridget shoots out of bed, runs down several flights of stairs into the kitchen where she sees Lizzie standing there. When she starts to go into the sitting room, Lizzie says to her, "Oh, Maggie, don't go in. I have to go to get a doctor. Quick, go over. I've got to have a doctor." "Well, why don't you go over and get a doctor?" Bridget ran over to Dr. Bowen's home. It was right across the street, but she found out he wasn't home. He was doing house calls. She then ran back across the street to the Borden home. She asks Lizzie, "Where were you when this happened? I thought I latched the screen door when I came in." Lizzie said she'd been outside and that she'd heard a groan coming from the inside of the house. So when she ran back to the house, she noticed that the door was wide open. She was outside and she heard a groan from inside the house. How is that possible? How did Lizzie hear a groan from inside the house when Bridget, who was laying down upstairs and could hear doors opening and closing, heard nothing? She didn't hear any groan. But Lizzie says she heard a groan, and that's what caused her to go back to the house. Then she told Bridget to go get Alice Russell. Alice Russell, once again, was Lizzie's friend, the friend she'd visited the night before, and told her that something terrible was going to happen. Did she really want Alice there, or did she want Alice there as a witness to testify that Lizzie had told her the night before she was afraid something was going to happen? Lizzie says that she wants Bridget to get Alice because she doesn't want to be alone in the house. Yet you keep sending Bridget out to go get people, which leaves you actually alone in the house. And if Bridget stayed in the house, you wouldn't be alone in the house. And why are we in the house anyways? Why are we in the house anyways? I think this is insane. Somebody was murdered in the sitting room. The person could still be in there waiting to murder you, and everybody's hanging out in the kitchen just talking about not wanting to be alone in the house. We're going to bring in a different person now, and this person is the neighbor of the Bordens, Adelaide Churchill. Now, Adelaide was a widow. She lived next door to the Bordens with her son. And I get the impression that Mrs. Churchill is a little bit of that nosy neighbor. You know, she's kind of always watching what everybody's doing, looking out her windows. But she claims she was looking out the window and she saw Bridget running back to the Borden home from Dr. Churchill's house, and Bridget looked stressed out and pale as a sheet. So she looked out the window that was facing the Borden home, saw Lizzie standing in the doorway, not moving, and called over to her and said, "Lizzie, what happened?" And Lizzie said, "Mrs. Churchill, please come quick. Something's happened to Father." When Mrs. Churchill comes over, Lizzie's sitting at the bottom of the stairs. She's no longer standing by the door. And when Mrs. Churchill asks her the same question Bridget asked her, "Lizzie, where were you?" Lizzie tells her, "I was in the barn looking for some iron." And she doesn't elaborate. But then she does tell her also the same story about Abby being called away with a note earlier in that day. She tells the story about her being afraid something happened to her father because the family may have been poisoned. And she says, "You know, I actually think I heard Mrs. Borden come in earlier. She might be here still." And Lizzie keeps saying the same thing. "We need a doctor. I need a doctor." So Mrs. Churchill says, "Okay, hang tight." She ran down 2nd Street to another person's home, a Mr. Hill, and she asked Mr. Hill if he could go and get Dr. Bowen. When she got back, both Bridget and Dr. Bowen were making their way to the Borden home. Dr. Bowen went into the sitting room, and he made a startled sound, which the women could hear from the kitchen. What Dr. Bowen found was Andrew Borden laying on the couch, clearly dead. His face had been chopped up, basically, almost to a point where he was unrecognizable, and there was quite a bit of blood. Dr. Bowen checked his pulse, noticed that he was still warm, but he did not have a pulse. He pronounced him dead, and when he turned around, he saw that Lizzie Borden had followed him halfway into the room. And he asked her the same question that Mrs. Churchill and Bridget had asked her. "Lizzie, where were you when this happened?" She said she'd been out in the barn finding some iron, and then she made a statement about one of her father's tenants possibly wanting him dead. She said she'd heard many conversations between her father and his tenants recently that had ended in a little bit of conflict. Lizzie asked the doctor to send a telegram to her sister Emma in Fairhaven to let her know what had happened and that she should come home. Before he left for the telegraph office, he asked, "Where's your stepmother?" And she told him the same story about the note calling her away to visit a sick friend. Right after Dr. Bowen left, Alice Russell showed up, and Lizzie kept making these statements about how she wished somebody would go look for Mrs. Borden. That she might have come in, she might be here, can somebody go look for her? And it's like, why don't you go look for her, lady? This is your house, you're familiar with it. Why aren't you going to look for her? Why do you keep asking everybody else to look for her? And the reason for this, in my opinion, is typically when somebody kills somebody, they don't want to be the one to find the body. They don't want to be associated with that at all. So Lizzie may have been basically setting up these other women to be the ones to find the body because she didn't want to get her hands dirty. Both Mrs. Churchill and Bridget were highly hesitant to go upstairs in a house that somebody had just been murdered in, but they agreed to it. Bridget led the way, Mrs. Churchill followed, and as Mrs. Churchill walked up the steps, she could kind of see, as her eyes became level with the landing, the form of a person laying on the floor of the guest bedroom. And she'd had enough at that point, so she ran back downstairs. She's like, I don't want to see anything. But she does tell Lizzie, like, yeah, she's up there. We found her. Bridget does make her way all the way up the stairs into the guest bedroom and finds Abby Borden laying face down, completely hacked to death from the back. Now, Andrew Borden showed no signs of violence besides to his face, the left side of his face mostly, and the front. One of his eyeballs was completely cut in half. He had 10 to 11 strikes on his face. Like I said, he had been hit so many times with this axe or this hatchet that he was unrecognizable to look at. Abby Borden showed no signs of violence on the front of her body. All her wounds were to the back of her head, which suggested that somebody had come up on her when her back was turned and had caught her by surprise. It's speculated that she had been in the guest bedroom making up the bed and the room for when John returned, because that was the room he had been staying in. She wanted it to be made up and ready for him when he spent the night there that night. They never recovered the murder weapon, and what was odd was the murders appeared to have been committed about 90 minutes apart, maybe almost 2 hours apart, with Abby Borden being killed first and Andrew Borden being killed about an hour and a half later. Abby's blood was dark and thick and had already begun to congeal, and Andrew Borden, his blood was still kind of seeping out of the wounds, and it was thinner and his body was still warm. Lizzie and Alice Russell are still in the kitchen, and Alice is, fussing over her friend. Oh my God, are you okay? But she too asks Lizzie, where were you when this happened? Lizzie said she was in the barn looking for some iron or tin to fix her screen. At some point, Alice began to undo the collar of Lizzie's dress because she thought she was going to faint, and she wanted to be able to give her some air. In the old days, when women were upset, they had to get some air or they might faint because they were so sensitive that anything just might make them pass out at any moment. And Lizzie actually grabbed her hand and stopped her and said, I'm not going to faint. So she didn't want her messing around with her dress. But at some point, Lizzie went upstairs to spend some time alone in Emma's room, and when Alice followed her a couple of minutes later to check on her, she saw Lizzie walking out of the bedroom, tying the ribbons on a pink wrap dress. Both Bridget and Mrs. Churchill had testified that earlier in that day, Lizzie had been wearing a light blue gingham patterned dress with some sort of dark blue diamond or figure on it. So why had Lizzie changed her dress was the big question. Some people speculate that Lizzie had changed her dress in order to hide any blood on it, but nobody reports seeing her with any blood on her dress when they first showed up to the house, so that's highly unlikely. Other people think she might have had a dress over the dress that people saw, so she murdered her parents and then took off the dress that had blood all over it and got rid of it, and the dress underneath was the blue dress that people saw. I don't think either one of those is highly likely. If Lizzie had killed Abby and Andrew Borden, the amount of times they were struck, the amount of blood that was on the bodies, she would have had blood all over. It would have splattered on her. So the dress that she was wearing when everybody showed up would have had notable signs of blood. And it also would have been pretty noticeable if she'd had a dress underneath another dress, because the dresses she wore were tailored to her. They were quite tight. So to have another dress under your dress, it would just look bulky and off, and somebody would have noticed. I think it's far more likely that Lizzie stripped down to her undergarments before she committed either murder and then just got dressed again before calling to Bridget and saying somebody had killed her father. By the time Dr. Bowen got back from the telegraph office, there was an officer on scene, Officer Allen, who was first on scene, and Mrs. Churchill told Dr. Bowen that they had found Abby upstairs in the guest bedroom. There was only one officer on the scene right away because the rest of the police force was actually at Rocky Point Amusement Park. It's an amusement park on Rhode Island. They were there for some sort of police event. But once Officer Allen realized that this was a pretty serious matter and it was an all hands on deck kind of situation, he sent a message to have them called back. Except for Officer John Fleet. John Fleet had stayed home from the amusement park that day because he was taking care of his sick wife. So he was actually in town when the call came in, and as soon as he heard, he grabbed his coat and he went to the Borden house. The police arrived on the scene and they looked around, right? But they were kind of puzzled. The whole thing seemed off. There wasn't a ton of blood anywhere besides on the bodies. They were also concerned about the viciousness of the attacks. This was something they just hadn't really seen before in their town. As they were walking around the house, Lizzie let them know that in the cellar downstairs, there was a bowl of bloody rags that were soaking. And these were there because it was her time of the month and to not be concerned by it. I'm sure the officers were so scandalized by her discussing these matters with her that they probably didn't even want to go near that bowl of bloody rags, and they didn't ask her any more questions about it. They did, however, question Lizzie about her whereabouts that day, and she said that she had been in the kitchen. She was going to iron some handkerchiefs. She got the iron out, and while she was waiting for her irons to get hot, she sat down at the table and began to flip through a Harper's magazine, an old Harper's magazine she found in the kitchen. She said at this time she believed that Abby Borden was either on the second floor or still out of the house taking care of her sick friend, and she believed that her father was napping in the sitting room. As she was waiting for her irons to heat up, she began to think about a fishing trip that she and her friends were going to be going on in a couple of days, and she began to wonder if she had any sinkers for her fishing lines. So that's when she went out to the barn to check and see if there was any iron laying around that she could use for a sinker. She then left through the kitchen door, and she left the door unlocked behind her, and she made her way to the barn. As she was passing the barn, she noticed the pear tree had some really ripe pears that had fallen on the ground underneath the tree. So she went and grabbed those, 3 of them. She then made her way the rest of the way to the barn, and she climbed up in the loft of the barn, where she proceeded to sit down for 20 to 30 minutes, stare out the barn loft window at the house that she could see clearly from her position in the barn loft, and eat her 3 pears. Now remember, this is literally a 90-something degree day, and in the barn, it's going to be even more stifling hot. After she finished her pears, she went to the other side of the barn and began looking through boxes and drawers to see if she could find anything to use for sinkers. It was while she was doing this that she heard a groan from the house and something that sounded like a scraping. At this point, she ran back to the house and noticed the door was wide open, went in, and found her father. Now, I don't know how far away from the house the barn is, but this is so unbelievable to me that she was in the barn, rifling through like tools and metals and things, and heard this groan and a scraping sound. And yet Bridget, who was in the house, heard no groans and no scraping sounds. How did she hear that from the barn? This makes even less sense than what she told Bridget, which she'd been outside when she heard the groan. And as nice as a snack of 3 pears sound, I love pears. I think they're delicious. I probably would not choose to eat them in an oven. The barn would have probably been over 100 degrees. It was dusty. It was hot. There's really no airflow. So why do you choose to eat your delicious pear snack in this hot barn? When you have a nice little pear tree you could have sat under, you have a kitchen, which is probably cooler than this barn you're sitting in. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up, and the police agreed. They noticed her behavior was very off, especially considering she just found her father brutally murdered. She was cold, she was distant, she didn't seem upset or panicked at all, and I find this a little iffy and almost offensive because it's not easy to describe how somebody would act when they come upon something that's traumatizing. She may have been in shock. Also, I have an inkling that the police and the men of this day expected women to be in a complete state of panic, hysteria, when they see something horrific. And she may have been upset. She may have been, visibly upset, but maybe she wasn't upset enough for them as they thought a woman should act. However, when they referred to Abby as her mother, she had something to say about that. She sharply corrected them. "She's not my mother. My own mother is dead." And I find that a little odd. I do find that a little odd because it's like, this woman just got murdered. She may not be your mother, but she's a person who's dead and you don't know what happened, apparently. So is it the most important thing to correct the police officers on whether or not she's your actual biological mother or not? I mean, she has raised you for like 20 years, so you could give her a little respect, right? Another officer commented on the fact that he'd been to war. He had walked through piles of dead bodies, and what he saw in the Borden home that day topped them all. He was incredibly surprised how Miss Borden managed to keep her composure, barely batting an eye. As Lizzie is being interviewed, her friend Alice is nearby, the caring friend trying to make sure Lizzie's okay and doesn't faint, and she hears the police ask Lizzie, "Did your father have any enemies, or do you know of anybody who might want to hurt him?" And Lizzie answers no. And that's when Alice jumps in and she's like, "But Lizzie, remember what you told me last night?" Lizzie told the whole story about the barn being broken into, the house being broken into, the family possibly having been poisoned, the many heated interactions between her father and his business associates, and she recalled a specific event, probably a week before the murders, but she couldn't remember properly, but she thinks like a week or two before the murders, that there was a man in her house talking to her father, and she overheard. She's overhearing a lot of stuff, but she overheard this conversation. She couldn't hear it all, but she got bits and pieces. And basically, the man was saying to Andrew Borden, "I would like to have my business in that building." And Andrew Borden said, "Well, I don't want you to." And the man replied to Andrew Borden, "I thought you had a reputation for being a man who liked money, that you would let your store go for anything." And Andrew Borden corrected him and said, "You are mistaken." Lizzie said she didn't hear everything, but she heard their voices raising, and at one point, her father told the man he'd been there long enough and he should leave. So basically, Andrew Borden kicked this man out of the house. They asked her, "Who was this guy? Did you see what he looked like? Do you know where he lives, what his name is?" And she's like, "No, I've never seen him before. I think he was from out of town because he mentioned something about having to go back home and talk to his partner." This just sounds like a made-up story to me, honestly. How convenient is it that this man is from out of town and you don't know who he is and you can't describe him? Lizzie says she also recalls a time when she came home one night and there was a dark figure sneaking around the house, but she could not elaborate on that either. Later that day, after Lizzie had been questioned, she went to go relax in her bedroom, and the police wanted to search her room and her clothes. The police knocked on her bedroom door. They had to ask permission. It was only right to do so from a lady. You can just go through a lady's things without asking for her permission. And Dr. Bowen, who was in the room with her, opened the door a crack and asked what they wanted. Now, Dr. Bowen was in the room because he was dosing Lizzie with morphine, because she was so visibly upset, I guess, that he thought she needed morphine to calm down. The police told Dr. Bowen they wanted to search the room, and he said, "Hold on," and he closed the door. He asked Lizzie. He came back to the door, opened it again, and said to the police, "Miss Borden wants to know if it's absolutely necessary to search her room." The police were like, "Yeah, 2 people were just killed in the house, so typically it's protocol to search the house, so yeah, we need to get in." The police came in and they searched through her drawers and her closets, but they didn't find anything. They also searched Bridget's room, they searched the guest room where John Morse had been staying and Abby had been killed, and they searched Emma's room. They also obviously went and looked into the barn, where Lizzie said she'd spent about 20 to 30 minutes that afternoon eating pears and looking for lead. And what was most startling to the detectives was there were no footprints in the sawdust or the dust in general. It appeared to them that nobody had been in that barn for quite some time, and she definitely hadn't been there that morning. That night, Lizzie slept in her own home, and her uncle John Morse stayed there as well in a different room, obviously, because his room was covered in blood and was a crime scene. And Alice Russell also stayed the night, and she stayed in Abby and Andrew's room, which is so creepy to me. Can you imagine, as Alice, having to sleep in the bed of a man and wife who had just been brutally murdered and would never sleep in that bed again? I would be totally creeped out. I would not want to do it. Could they have not stayed somewhere else? Like, couldn't they have gone to Alice's house? The bodies of Abby and Andrew were in the sitting room, laid out there. I don't know if this was common for that time. It seems really strange. I feel like in a crime scene, the bodies should be taken away to have an autopsy done on them. And this really shows you how different the 1800s were from today. If today somebody was murdered, their body wouldn't be left at the crime scene where the person that might be the murderer lived and slept. It just seems so strange. John Hyde of the Fall River Police Department was posted outside of the Borden home this night. And he testifies that at around 8:30 p.m. that evening, Alice Russell came to the door, said that they were going to go to bed, but if the police officers needed anything, they could knock and they would let them in. Alice testifies that after this, though, Lizzie told her she was going to go empty the toilet pan in the cellar, and Alice offered to do it for her, trying to be a supportive and kind friend, but Lizzie insisted she wanted to do it, so Alice said, okay, that's fine, you can do it. I'll come with you to keep you company and hold the lamp. So Officer Hyde, who's sitting outside the house, actually sees their whereabouts in the cellar because of the lamp. He sees Lizzie in the cellar. He sees Alice in the cellar holding the lamp. They stay there a couple of minutes. Lizzie dumps something into the sink, and then they go back up. What surprised him was about 15 minutes later, Lizzie returned to the cellar alone. She had a small lamp. She set it on the table. She went back to the sink and crouched nearby it for about 1 to 2 minutes. He could not see what she was doing. But after that 1 to 2 minutes, she got back up, went back upstairs, and that was it. We have no idea what Lizzie was doing in the cellar that evening. But what seems obvious is she wanted to go down to the cellar alone initially. But Alice was trying to be a good friend and came along to keep her company, probably still worried that she was in shock. And so she waited until Alice was unavailable so that she could go back down to the cellar by herself. The next day, Officer Hyde asks Alice about the incident, and Alice says, no, she wasn't there by herself, I was with her. And Officer Hyde says, yes, you were with her initially, but about 15 minutes after, she went back down by herself, and Alice said, oh, that must have been when I was in the bath. So Lizzie waited for Alice to get in the bath, and then she went down by herself. About 15 minutes after this conversation, Alice approaches Officer Hyde again and asks him to come up with her to the bedroom she slept in last night. She has something to show him. When they get up to the bedroom, she shows him this 20-inch club of some kind that was laying on the floor at the foot of the bed. And she's kind of stressed out about it. She says, what is this? I slept in this bedroom last night. If this was here when I went to bed, I surely would have seen it. I don't think it was there when I went to sleep. So she was really concerned about it. What I think happened is Lizzie didn't really want Alice in the house any longer. She had performed her duties of what Lizzie had wanted her to do, which was being there when the police questioned Lizzie and reminding Lizzie about the threats that had been made to her family that she should tell the police about. She'd done her duty, and now Lizzie didn't want her there anymore, so I believe that she was trying to scare this girl with the club at the foot of the bed. Maybe make Alice think that the house wasn't safe to be in, so she would go home. Needless to say, after that night, Alice no longer slept in that bedroom, but she did stay in the home, just in a separate room. On August 6th, the Saturday after the murders, a funeral is held for Abby and Andrew Borden in the family home. After the funeral, the police come back and do a more thorough search of the home, and they also ask Lizzie to give them the clothes she was wearing the day of the murders. She hands over 3 items: a dark blue blouse, a patterned skirt, and a white underskirt. By the time Emma returned home from Fairhaven, the town was already in a tizzy, and rumors had begun to spread. There was newspaper after newspaper article being printed about the horrific murders and the possible suspects. It's often said that Lizzie wasn't suspected initially, and I don't believe that. I think they suspected her from day one. I think they really knew something was off about her story, but it was hard for them, and it took some time for them to come to terms with the fact that a member of the weaker sex could perform such a terrible act. The day of Andrew and Abby's funeral, the mayor of the town actually came to the home, talked to Emma and Lizzie, and asked them if they could just stay in the house a little bit and avoid the public eye. That's going to be the end of part 1, guys. Stay tuned for part 2 tomorrow. Stay kind and stay beautiful. Love you. Bye.